Welcome to the Medieval Archaeology in Egypt seminar, hosted by the Center of Islamic Archaeology, University of Exeter. The seminar series is an initiative of Professor Timothy Ansel, the director of the center, building on our previous successful seminar on medieval archaeology in the Horn of Africa. In our first session, Professor Ala al-Habashi addressed urban archaeology from historic Cairo. For those who missed it, I shall leave the link to our YouTube channel in the chat box. But today, we shall go around 900 kilometers south from Cairo along the Nile to visit the old city of Aswan. We are fortunate to have Mr. Wolfgang Muller, the field director for the last 20 years, speaking to us today. Mr. Muller is a deputy director of the Swiss Institute of Architectural and Archaeological Research on Ancient Egypt in Cairo. Since 2004, he has been the field director of the joint Swiss-Egyptian mission at the Old Aswan. His presentation will be 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of discussion. I urge you to leave your comments at any time during his presentation on the chat box. I will read them at the end and present them to him. For now, I ask you kindly to turn off your cameras and mute your mic, and I leave the floor for you, Mr. Muller, to address us about Old Aswan. Thank you.
Problem. At first, I want to thank the organizers of the series for inviting me and thus giving me a chance to report on our recent research on medieval Aswan. Before I start my lecture, I want to introduce a recent monograph of our Sahini series on the pottery on the early Islamic pottery from Aswan by Gregory Williams. He's a member of our mission, and he studied the pottery and also some of the areas and presented them in his dissertation. So this is the publication of his dissertation. And I will start with a short summary of the historical background. And here it's important to give as a reference the contribution of Sophia Björnesjö in the recent publication of the so-called Fatimid Cemetery by the German Archaeological Institute, edited by Philip Speiser and Giorgio Nogara. So this short contribution by Sophia Björnesjö is the best, let's say, account of the historical sources on medieval Aswan and what they tell us about the city and its population. The history of Aswan is, of course, a very long one. So we have the first traces of human activity as early as the middle of the 4th millennium BC. Then we have an urban tradition, at least since the late Pharaonic period. Roman Aswan, and especially late antique Aswan, was a very important town, mostly for its quarrying industry and as a garrison for at least 3 auxiliary Roman units. At the end of Roman rule in Egypt, it seems that Aswan at least got the status of a metropolis, but this is not sure, because the metropolis of the first Upper Egyptian nome throughout the late antique history was Omboy, modern Komombo. But still, Aswan was an important town. The heyday of the city, anyhow, clearly is the early Islamic and early medieval period of Egypt. There are several historical landmarks. So the first, of course, at the latest in 652 AD, the town was conquered by an Arab army that probably came directly from the Hejaz region of the Arab Peninsula via the Red Sea to the Nile Valley. In 652, also the Pact Treaty was signed with Nubia, and this treaty secured peaceful coexistence between Islamic Egypt and Christian Nubia for a very long time. There was an exchange arranged between goods and slaves between Egypt and Nubia, and this exchange took place on a location called Al-Khazar. Al-Khazar has recently been identified with Hisn el-Bab, a huge fortress just to the east of Philae Island. This Hisn el-Bab has been investigated first by Pamela Rose and Alison Gascoigne, and is now still investigated by Pamela Rose and the Austrian Archaeological Institute. The next historical landmark, so to say, is 827 AD, when Ibn Hawkal mentions the construction of fortifications in Aswan, probably a town wall, as a protection against the badger. So mentioning the badger, one must say that the tribes around Aswan, both the Arab and the Nubian tribes, were all the medieval period over, they were a factor, destabilizing and endangering the coherence, the administrative coherence of the region. And often the central power was not able to exact control over the Aswan region because these tribes were too strong. Aswan is described in sources, of course, most of them are later, but early Islamic and early medieval Aswan is described as one of the most prosperous towns of Egypt, one of the largest towns. It was a center of learning, and of course, it was the capital of Upper Egypt. The reason for this wealth was Egypt's function as a node, Aswan's function as a node for the pilgrim, for the route of the pilgrims, that until the middle of the 11th century AD led up the Nile Valley until Aswan, and then via the Wadi al-Laki to Aidhab, and then further to the east towards Mecca. This route of pilgrims was also one of the main trade routes towards the east. So Aswan was an important center both for the pilgrims and for the trade. Another source for the wealth was mining activity in the Wadi al-Laki, that started already in the second half of the 9th century AD. From the 13th century AD, the Badger Bedouins again took control of this area, and the mining more or less was impossible. Sometime in the middle of the 11th century, second half of the 11th century AD, Aswan lost this role as an important node to Kuz. This town in Upper Egypt became the capital of, became first the center for the pilgrimage, because then the route changed and also the trade routes changed. So both pilgrims and goods went up the Nile only until Kuz, and then to the east to Kosir, and then further on towards the Arab Peninsula, and later on also India and the Far East. At the latest, at that time, the decline of Aswan has started, of course, because the major source of income was lost. The prosperity of Aswan in the early Islamic and early medieval period is not reflected in the historical sources, and it's also not easy to trace in the archaeological record. As mentioned, the stability of the region was always endangered by the tribes, and in 1068, an uprising led to a complete loss of control by the central Fatimid government until 1077 AD, when Egypt was completely reorganized. The whole administration changed, and then Kuz became the administrative capital of Upper Egypt. So Aswan also lost its important administrative role, and now the decline was unstoppable. In the Ayyubid and Mamluk period, again, uprisings by the Banu Khans and the Badger led to a very difficult situation. And further on in the 15th century, Makrisi tells us that the Black Death killed 20,000 people in Aswan. So Aswan was again hit severely, and later on by new uprisings. So in the 16th century, there's a description of the town. It says that the town is mostly destroyed and abandoned and in ruins. So the days of glory were once and for all over for Aswan. The historical topography, of course, was one of the main goals of our project, to reconstruct the topography of medieval Aswan and of ancient Aswan. Here, of course, the location, all of you know it, in the very south of Egypt. And this is the first historical map of interest to us from the Description de l'Egypte. It shows the situation in Aswan at the end of the 18th century. And here we have Sien Modern. The modern Aswan at the time was a small village in the south. Sien Antique here was abandoned, and there is no architecture, there are no houses here, and no inhabitation. This means that before Aswan in the early medieval period, covered both Siena Antique and Siena Moderne, so the whole area was part of the town, and now it shrunk to a much smaller size. The satellite image, we see the situation with from the English Dam in the south, so the whole cataract region. Here is the island of Elephantine, and to the east of it, Aswan. We have this already in the Roman period. Aswan was not a standalone entity. It was part of an agglomeration of settlements. So the bishop of Aswan, that's attested from the 4th century AD, was bishop of Saini, of Elephantine, and of Contrasienem. This means, of course, that this is a larger group of an area, more than just one city. We have a similar situation in the medieval period because while we do not know where Contrasienem was located, we have several monastic communities on the West Bank. So we must mention, of course, Deran Bahadra, which is recently investigated by a team from the Freie Universität Berlin and the German Archaeological Institute, and we have the monastery on the Kuba del Hauer. So it's a similar situation, not identical, but we have activity on the West Bank and we have the center in Aswan. Here we see the cadastral map of 1904 superimposed on the satellite image from 2001. And you see all these red dots are our excavations, and the magenta dot or pink dots mark auger drillings. So we undertook an extensive geomorphological survey together with Morgan de Dapper from Ghent University to reconstruct the situation, the fluvial landscape of Aswan. And one of the main goals, of course, was to localize the riverbank in medieval and ancient Aswan. And here, the first thing is that you see the construction of the modern corniche is very recent, just from the middle of the 1970s. And then the former riverbank from the earlier 20th century shifted significantly towards the west. And if we look at the situation in ancient Aswan and also in the medieval period, you see that the riverbank here in the north coincides more or less with the modern Zug Street. So the economical center of the medieval town was very near to the river, as is of course not, it's logical. To the east, we have a group here of river branches. These are not proper river branches, but depressions in the granite landscape that were filled with water seasonally during very high floods. During most of the time, these areas were swampy areas that were not fit for habitation and for settlements. The Swiss-Egyptian Joint Mission at Old Aswan has been investigating Aswan since the year 2000. This is a very close cooperation with our Egyptian colleagues from the Inspectorate of the MOTA at Aswan. So what you see here, all these names, all these people, they participated in the work. They are also the result of a long-year training program where we were able to train a lot of inspectors in excavation techniques and documentation techniques. So they are able to do the excavations and also document them. And this is important because we need all over the year a supervision of construction activity in the town. And of course, we need the help of the Egyptian authorities to stop construction work and grant us access to sites. I already mentioned the rescue excavations. From the 96 areas that have been excavated up to now in Aswan, only 4 are protected areas that are owned by the Egyptian state, areas that cannot be overbuilt or destroyed by modern buildings. And only in these areas we are able to conduct proper research excavations. The vast majority of areas are rescue excavations. And this means it's preventive archaeology, just like in urban archaeological projects all in Europe and everywhere else. Construction work is supervised. Interventions are archaeological intervention when necessary is exacted, and excavation starts in order to save at least the information in these areas that are afterwards overbuilt with modern structures. And of course, this work needs the executive help of the Egyptian authorities. One of the results of our work is this threat assessment map, where you see more or less endangered areas. So the uninhabited parts, of course, are not of so much interest, but if a construction work happens in this area, so the center of the Greco-Roman town, the Greco-Roman necropolis, or you see here in yellow approximately the Islamic town, then of course archaeological intervention of a major scale is necessary. Here is the approximate extent of the Islamic town according to our work. So the Greco-Roman town only measured around 13 hectares. Of course, all of that are approximations, but still it gives an idea. And the Islamic town is much, much larger. So here we have probably up to 30 hectares of area and around 5,000 to 6,000 inhabitants. These numbers show that the 20,000 people mentioned by Magrisi are, of course, too high. This is a very high or too high number. But again, it gives an idea of the size of this disease. Now, finally, to the archaeological evidence, to our core business, so to say. I organized the archaeological evidence into topics. At first, we start with fortifications and periphery of Aswan, and this is mostly in the very south of the town. Here we start with area 32. You see the black here, this is the town wall shown on the Description de l'Égypte, superimposed on the modern cadastral map. Area 32 is here on an old historical photograph by Mittelholzer from 1926. You see the Anglican church that was constructed by George Summers Clark and destroyed in 1995 when the modern cathedral was built. To the south, when the Coptic church decided to build a school and a hostel to the south of the modern cathedral, we started rescue excavations and we found this building. So this is the largest and most prominent building from the medieval period we have found until now in Aswan. The building covers around 200 square meters. Its function is rather enigmatic. Gregory Williams, he compared the building to the Caserel Muller. These are huge ruins that stood in the modern Ferial Garden until the 20s of the 20th century. So this is probably a similar structure. So inside the town wall, we have here a group of this Caserel Muller was located here. So we have several prominent buildings just inside the medieval town wall. The ground plan here, most of the rooms showed pavements carefully made of fired bricks. And here we have an entrance, elevated entrance from the south into a vestibule, room 10. From this vestibule, only room 8 could be reached. And so this is an isolated reception area, probably of some kind, in the very south of the town. We do not know the function, and also we have to state clearly that the building, it's not all of the building, so it continued further towards the north. But this part was destroyed when the church was built. The next area, just to the south of area 32, is of major interest because there we encountered the town wall shown on the Description de l'Égypte. You see here the location is marked in red. To the east of this location, you see this villa here. It's a villa built by Charles Voysey in 1905, or designed by Voysey, and probably also the garden is part of this design of this ensemble. Villa and garden were prominent examples of colonial architecture in Aswan, and the villa is still preserved, but the garden was destroyed when the construction of a new mall started. You see here the situation. This is the wall I mentioned. So it's rather modest. It's only 2 meters wide. And here is the villa of Voysey, and you see here that it was just possible to stop the construction work before this permanent building that is now registered as a monument was destroyed. Here's the plan, and you see the town wall again. And the earliest structures we found predate the town wall, and these structures were rather strange because you see here, these are rows alignments of vessels with in vertical position. Partly they are with the rim downwards. So these vessels limit or mark areas or lots. So they kind of fences or small walls. And they, of course, can only be of symbolic value because they did not really, were no obstacle for man or animals alike. Gregory Williams here, he collected some of the pots from these vessels, and you see this is typical late Roman emperor, Aswan emperor. So we have the classical late antique material, we have slightly later siltback shaped jars here. And the good thing, the important thing is that the town wall was built immediately on top of these vessels. So the vessels, and we had a lot of them, they give a very solid terminus bosquem for the building. And as these vessels, similar structures were found in Istabel Amtar and in Achmim, and everywhere the date is 7th, 8th century AD. So this means that this is a terminus bosquem for the wall, and it's possible that this wall is the fortification mentioned before that was constructed in 827. It's of course not sure because these could well be much older vessels just out of use and reused in this function here, but still we have this terminus and it gives us a chronological framework. So you see again the town wall. The modest dimensions of this town wall are explained by Gregory Williams by the fact that this is mostly a curtain wall. It's an obstacle. And to the east of west of this wall, massive bastions, as we will see, protected the south of the city. Of course, the wall was also preserved in the western section of the site. You see it here marked in blue. And this is interesting because we see here in the south, wind-blown sand, and to the east, we see a dense settlement stratigraphy. So in this case, it's completely clear what is intramural and what's extramural area in this part of the town. And just a last photo of the wall here to show you the situation. Behind you have the Coptic Cathedral and this new building of the Coptic Church that's sitting on top of the building in Area 32. And just in front of that, you see here the wall. There are some vessels contemporary with the wall, more or less. So this is an example here. This was deposited inside a former oven. And there are more amphora and some tableware also. The history of this area, of course, was not over with the town wall. Soon after the wall was constructed, houses were constructed in this area, and a more or less densely built up city quarter came into existence. The most important house here is house 2, probably of IUB date, and here we see this rectangular room here, what I call the furnace. You see here a channel, and the channel is leading towards a vertical sewage pit. So you see here the channel, you see this room, and you see this vertical shaft that's with an inner coating of fired bricks and stones, very carefully made. So this is a typical feature of medieval Aswan, as we will see. The furnace could very well be the heating installation for a heated basin of a bath. But of course, this is with the ruins we have, we cannot ascertain this hypothesis, verify this hypothesis. If we go back to the Description de l'Égypte, and you see here the town wall, that's already called, by the way, an Arab wall, so the dating is correct of the Description de l'Égypte. We have here this bastion, and this is one of the major bastions that were the main fortification and protection of the town towards the south. So if you look at this picture of Mittelholzer here, we have again the bastion, and at that time there was already a house built on top of it, but it's still quite clear and visible. In a historical photograph from 1851, I thank Cornelius von Pilgrim for granting me access to this picture. You clearly see the same bastion. There's a lot of debris from the destroyed wall, and here is the bastion again, built on top and against a granite outcrop. This granite outcrop is famous, by the way, because here the famous inscription of Bark, a rock inscription from the time of Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV is located until today. Interesting here is the masonry of the wall. We have a stone wall in the lower part and mud brick on the upper part of the wall. And here is the last remains of this masonry, with a very typical stone masonry here. It's destroyed here by this building from the earlier 20th century, and here in the south, in the north, it's destroyed by a modern house. So this is the very last part of this bastion that's still preserved. Now the next topic is economy, of course, and here we have to mention the Souk area, and at the northern and southern end of the modern Souk Street, area 37 is a rescue excavation, a very small excavation in the middle of the Souk Street, because there a new gate for the Souk, for the modern Souk, was built. This is a very narrow, very deep excavation. It's 11 meters of stratigraphy, and you see here layers and layers of streets. So these are all the streets of the Souk. So the stratigraphy, the complete stratigraphy of the Souk Street of Aswan, from the beginning in the 9th to 10th century AD until the modern period. You see here to the east, these houses, they show porches, probably areas for economic activities or trading or whatever, and very narrow, small houses behind that. The next area, so this area 37 was studied by Pamela Rose and Alison Gascoigne, and is still studied, so they had a look at the pottery. Area 3 is located further to the north, to the south, I'm sorry, and Area 3 is famous for its main monument, the so-called Temple of Domitian, which is a temple from the Roman imperial period that was later integrated into the Islamic town, so it became part of the house. Area 3 is just to the east of the modern German hospital of Aswan. You see here the location on the Google Earth map. And here's, as you see, a curved road from the medieval period and larger houses here with the Temple of Domitian as part of one of those. And here smaller houses, smaller rooms to the east. And all of these buildings here, you see the blue stratum, C3 and C2 are probably Ayyubid, early Mamluk. The red walls mark earlier structures, probably from Fatimid houses, very high walls, and these walls were partly made of fired bricks and thus preserved and became parts of the later walls from the Ayyubid and early Mamluk period. Here is an image of that. We had to do this excavation because the street was collapsing on top of it, and we had to build a new retaining wall, as you see here. From this earlier Fatimid walls, you see here one detail. This is kind of an ornamental lampstand. That's a lampstand that's here integrated into the wall. And here you see the holes for wooden beams that probably mark the second floor of this house. So you see to which level, to which height it was preserved. In the Ayyubid or probably early Mamluk period, several of these houses here served as shops, and some of them as workshops. And in this case here we see and probably an oil press. So this here is the mortar for grinding the product. Here it is pressed, and the oil or whatever it was the product of this process was collected here in a stone vessel that was sunk into the floor and covered with a wooden lid that was partly still preserved. So this is a very nice example of industrial activity in the town. One interesting feature of Area 3 has nothing to do with economy, but it's nevertheless very, very important, because this is the only example here of a sacral building from the medieval period we have found until now in our excavations. You see here this room, you of course recognize the small niche. It's carefully covered with white lime plaster. You see that carefully done. It's destroyed now, but it was really a nice floor made of, it's a pavement made of fired bricks. So this is clearly probably an open air praying area, something that was found as part of numerous tombs in the Fatimid cemetery of Aswan. So this is quite a typical feature there, but this is the only time we found such an installation within the town. And next, as I already said, that the riverbank, the location of the riverbank is of course crucial, because this is the interface between the town, the settlement, and the main line of communication in Egypt, the River Nile. So that's where all the goods and people and whatever were transported. And Area 52 is just to the west of Area 3. It's within the area of the modern Germania, and it's a rescue excavation that took place when the Germania built the new surgical theatre there. Here you see the location on the Description de l'Égypte. And this is the situation, and it very well illustrates a typical rescue excavation where it's difficult to assess how to protect these sites. We managed it here because it's very solid river sediment. A detail of this wall, and here another detail. So this is the river embankment wall from the early medieval, probably even early Islamic period, and the most striking feature here, is this vaulted, small, very narrow inlet. And this is not a gate or whatever. I think this is an inlet that allowed the water from the River Nile to enter here into this area, into this room. And in this room, there was a water lifting device or sack here. At least that's the idea. Because we found behind the wall, when we removed the wall, we found deep basins covered and coated in water-resistant lime plaster. And so the water was lifted here from the River Nile into these tanks, and from the tanks it was distributed throughout the town. This is now sloping down this inclined layer of debris. There are two layers of debris actually. Marks the abandonment and partly collapse of the wall, and then more or less sterile fluvial sediment accumulated on top of the debris. Coins from the debris give a terminus in the middle of the 14th century or second half of the 14th century here for this collapse, and probably for the abandonment of the southern part of the town. So this is one of the few areas where we really found evidence of this decline and of the shrinking of the town area. The most important part of any town, of course, are the houses where the people lived. And here I want to show us one of the earliest houses and nicest buildings we found. And this is a very luxurious building, more or less. We have only parts of it, but it had its own facility for the disposal of wastewater. Here with a collecting tank, and here with a small channel. You still see the covering slabs that led into a collecting channel here that was hewn into the granite. So channels like that are a typical feature of medieval, let's say probably Fatimid and Ayyubid Aswan. You see another example here from Area 3. So in this case, the channel leads into one of these vertical shafts. Let's say it's kind of a sanitary pit for the disposal of wastewater. Here the wastewater was disposed of directly into a channel. Probably because this area 31 is very much in the very far east of the town, so at the limit of the town proper. Area 84 now is another area with houses from the early Islamic or early medieval period. And you see here a typical rescue excavation in the modern district of Koka. And this excavation was done again as usual together with our Egyptian colleagues. And you see how well preserved these houses are. So several meters high. The walls are partly made of stone, especially in the door areas. The thresholds are preserved. And here, this is a very nice feature because you see this repair with fired bricks of the wall. On top is a window. I think probably this is due to the fact that from the window, buckets or baskets were pulled up here with groceries and other stuff like it happens today. And probably the area of the window was eroded over time and had to be repaired. A dating of these structures is difficult, but here you see the situation, our Egyptian colleagues at work, and you get a good idea also of the depth and of the area and of the dimensions of the architecture and of the state of preservation. The dating was difficult. Here you see one preserved vault of one of the houses that was completely filled later on. So the infill of the ruins of these houses and of the vault is dated to the Ayyubid or early Mamluk era period, but this is definitely much later than the houses themselves. And Gregory Williams estimated that the houses, as most structures in Aswan, could start at the beginning of building activity in the 9th or 10th century AD. Besides the house of the living, of course, there are places for the dead. And here I start with an area that's interesting because we have a late antique cemetery here. You see the tombs. And the interesting thing is that this is in the middle of the Islamic town. It's surrounded by densely built out city quarters. But here in this area, nothing happened. There was only waste deposited. You see the black layer here and here. This accumulated during the Fatimid period probably, and only after it was completely covered, building activity, construction activity started in the Ayyubid period when houses were built on top of this layer. So for a very long time, this cemetery was obviously a respected area within the town. So you see one of the Coptic tomb stela this one was published by Yitzhak Dijkstra. And here you see the massive black layer that mostly consisted of slag and ashes. So it's industrial waste. And it could be dated to the Ayyubid period by Gregory Williams. And you see here the vaults. These are two vaults of these typical late antique chamber tombs that are covered by the blackish layer. So here we say that there's not an immediate break in most areas between late antiquity and the early medieval period. So for a very long time, this area was kind of respected by the inhabitants. Area 31 now, I showed you the house before, was the most important areas concerning tombs, because here we found 7 burials and 2 of them had proper superstructures of the same kind as found in the Fatimid cemetery. So you see that if you look at the location again of 31, this is in the very northeast of the town. You see how far the cemetery, how huge the Fatimid, the medieval cemetery of Aswan was, much, much larger than what is left today. And these buildings, Gregory Williams, he compared them to the type 2 of Speiser and Bernessieu that is normally dated to the Fatimid period. In our case, it could be a little bit later. The interesting thing here is that we found a huge fireplace with lots of pottery and bones of mostly sheep. And this definitely was the place where feasts and meals took place near the deceased. So this is a very interesting aspect of human agency in cemeteries. So, and the ruins of the former house from the, let's say, 9th to 10th century AD, of course, were very handy because they were good as protection for the people and the tombs. So they left the walls standing, and within these walls, they constructed the tombs and had their feasts. You see again a picture of the situation. So now the last area with this was another typical rescue excavation with a rather extreme situation, because here we were allowed to excavate in the cellar of a modern house because they made a new floor there, and we were allowed to have a small trench. And here we found the remains of superstructures of burials similar to those in the Fatimid cemetery. And if you look at the location again, this is very near to the Fatimid cemetery. So clearly we have here the northernmost tombs of this cemetery in this house, and the dating of it by Gregory was able to date this also to the Ayyubid or early Mamluk period. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I didn't want it to end, actually.
Yeah, but it's more or less in time.
We wanted even to continue more than this. Thank you very much. It is for a dazzling presentation, more than actually I could have imagined. We are very lucky, really, to have you for a presentation of 20 years of work. We'll start the questions now. We already have some question, but I want to start to speak first about that part of our attendance has been minorly affected, not much. We have good 25 attendance and 50 registered, but part of it had been done because there is a strike in the academic circles here in UK, which somehow. But other than this, I'm sure everybody will try who attended have missed a lot of this presentation. So let us start by the questions, and please write it down here in the chat room. Okay, so we have A question from Professor Timothy Ansel, the director of the Center of Islamic Archaeology. Have you identified any Sudanese, Nubian, or other ceramics from elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa? Professor Ansel is very interested in that connection, and he just published a paper about the connections between the Horn of Africa and Cairo and trade in the Ayyubid period. So please, the first question.
Yes, I think it's, of course, a question that Gregory Williams would be more suited to answer, but the fact is that we have the situation, we have a huge amount of so-called Aswan pottery in Nubia, of course. Also, it's similar in the Roman period. But this seems to be a unidirectional thing. So we don't have the same amount, or we don't have a lot of Nubian material in Aswan itself. Probably we have evidence from Ostraka from the late Roman period, and this is probably also true for the Islamic period, that Aswan had a huge pottery industry, probably because we have very good clay resources with the so-called pink clay. It's very hard kaolinic clay. And we have evidence now that huge amounts of empty vessels were exported. It's not clear to where they were exported, but probably also to Nubia. So this could be an explanation why we have such a lot of these vessels, not only in Nubia, but also in the lower Nile Valley and even beyond Egypt. So Aswan had a very prominent pottery industry. It's at least for sure in the late Roman period, and we have some evidence of pottery manufacture also from the Islamic period, but not a lot. But of course, our areas are very small, as you saw. So I think my impression is, and what I get from the work of Gregory Williams, that there is not a lot of, let's say, real exchange. It's a one direction thing, more or less, with the pottery. And the second question, if I may answer that also, with the prosperity. Of course, this is always difficult to answer, because what is really prosperous? If you look at the Fatimid cemetery, it's very, very nice and very monumental, partly. But in the town itself, as I said, the only major building we found until now is the building in Area 32. Everything else is very small scale architecture. What's getting more and more, what we find more and more now are these channels and this elaborate system for wastewater disposal. There is the question whether these things, because normally in many towns of the Islamic period, such installations are around baths or similar installations where a lot of wastewater accumulated. So probably these channels and these installations, sewers, are indirect evidence of things we didn't find in our excavations. But of course, one of the things that's striking, the early Islamic period, let's say before the 9th century, it's very hard to find anything really structure or architecture-wise. As you saw these pottery fences and stuff like that, probably the inhabitants were, the room of the former Roman town was sufficient, and we have some evidence in Aswan that the houses, the late Roman, late antique houses, were still in use in the early Islamic period, so at least in the 8th century, until the 8th century AD. So probably that's the reason why there is so little construction work from this period, and the town didn't yet extend. So, but this already is a contradiction to some of the historical sources that state, or that led us to the expectation that early Islamic Aswan has to be this huge metropolis. And this is, of course, not, we did not find that for sure. And this is interesting because also in the Fatimid cemetery, as far as I'm informed, the stele, they are dislocated, of course, most of them or all of them, but at least they give an idea of the composition of the population and of the size of the population, and also, let's say, they give us an idea of the inhabitants of Aswan. And here we have to say that by far the most of these stela are from the Fatimid period. So They are not so much stela from the early Islamic period, but what one would actually expect according to some of the historical sources. So the early Islamic town, the pre-Fatimid town, I think was rather small, and only, of course, already before the Fatimids in the 9th and 10th century, construction work started. Let's say, if you can say like that, a positive contradiction to the historic record is that if you look at development, especially in the Ayyubid period, we do not see decline there really. So in the Ayyubid period, you have the town is really flourishing. So it's not there is not a one-to-one depiction of the historical record in the archaeological record, which is of course a normal situation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a question from Bailey Maxinis. Do you have any intervention in West Aswan, Gharb Aswan?
No, because this is not our concession. So the joint Swiss-Egyptian mission in Aswan is only we are only working in Old Aswan, let's say on the east bank of the Nile. There are I think interventions. There are no real rescue excavations. There was some work by the German Institute in the vicinity of the Kubbat el Hawa, and of course there's the Spanish mission and other missions on the Kubbat el Hawa, but they are working in the tombs. Then there is the mission of the Freie Universität Berlin in the Deran Bahadra, and the Spanish mission, of course, also in the monastery on the Deran Bahadra, and this has also been investigated by the Islamic Taftish of Aswan. So there is work done there, of course, but it's not by us. But of course, we are following and we are in good contact and used and need this information. For instance, it's very important with the monastery, with Deran Bahadra. So the results are really fascinating and great because you get a very good idea, a better idea of the composition and of the also religious situation, because it's very hard. You saw the Coptic stela, and of course it has to be assumed that we have a mixed population religion-wise, not only Christians or Muslims, but there is of course a strong Shia component in the population, especially with the Fatimid traditions in Aswan, and this stays the same. So we get much more information now from this work in Gharb Aswan, but it's of course not within our concession, and this is the work of others.
So let me follow on that. We have that from historical sources about the multi-religious of Aswan, but about archaeological evidence, in your work in the city, have you came up about identifying segregated areas, for example, of Sunni, Shias, Muslim, Christians? Or have you came up identifying certain houses that belong to one or another?
No, we had areas like in 31 with a lot of Arab. There are lots of Ostraka, and they give little information. Most of them they're only numbers or names on them, not much more. Maybe they were used for counting something or distributing something. So these Ostraka are studied by Amelia Someno. And there is some interesting Ostraka where you have Arabic Ostraka written in Coptic, so you have this mixture of both languages. You see this let's say it's an intermediary zone. It's proof of a development language-wise, maybe also culture-wise. But this is really very, very scarce. And as I showed you, the only sacred building of a kind we have, it's very modest in Area 3, but it was of course important for us to have this evidence. So we know up to now, but you have to be aware. That's why I showed in extenso the nature of our work. You know, these small rescue excavations, it's very easy not to hit an important building.
Yeah.
You know, to miss it, you know. We were lucky in most areas because very often we had crossings of streets and stuff, junctions and stuff like that, which helps with the plan. But if we have a complete room of a house, we are very lucky. Imagine it's average size of 50 square meters. Often it's only 30, and so it's impossible. we have to be careful. So the thing is, with our work, we get not a lot of information on the architecture. So we cannot, it's very hard. Lots of discussions with Felix Arnold, for instance, because he's a specialist, especially on Mediterranean Islamic architecture and also the late antique architecture on Elephantine Island. But it's very difficult to create a typology because as I said, we mostly have rooms or parts of rooms of houses, not more, because the areas are so small. So our information, what we can produce or what we can contribute is mostly the stratigraphy. So we have these huge sequences of material that helps us with creating a pottery sequence, and thus we can add to the historical record a little bit of the, let's say, the bone structure, the skeleton of the town, the framework. But you get a lot of information from the Souk area. But of course, we would have done everything to extend this excavation to get more information on the houses along the street. But what this was, there was a hotel in the way. So it's always, the work is, the work is limited in scale and limited in time. But the good thing is, it's a kind of a, this is a kind of a sampling method, because we have to excavate wherever there is a new house. So there is very little a priori knowledge. So we have lots of discoveries, but rarely architectural ones. So this is a problem.
And how these sites are preserved, if I may ask?
Sorry?
What is the state of preservation for these sites?
This is very, very different, because one problem if working in an urban environment like Aswan is that it's humid. So you have humidity, and the humidity is not permanent. It's not conserving. It's fluctuating. So you have dryness and you have humidity, because the humidity is mostly coming from the leaking sewers and water conduits of modern Aswan. So these are events when the whole area is flooded, then it's humid, and then it's dry again. So all organic matter is destroyed. So we have nearly no papyri. We have very, very little wood. So we have very little organic material left in Aswan. So this is one of the problems with the state of preservation, compared, for instance, to Elephantine Island, where everything is preserved because it's dry and high. So this is but on the other hand side, one has to say that there are these modern houses on top of the stratigraphy of the archaeological record that interests us. But if these houses are not modern houses, there was a law in the beginning of the 20th century that houses built in this area of Old Aswan are not allowed to have a cellar. So, and the depth of the foundations was limited. So these houses are also protecting the archaeological record, the stratigraphy. So compared to Elephantine, which was technically a protected comb, but it was also an exposed comb. So the area was not overbuilt, of course, but it was accessible to Sebachin and to all kinds of people. So to a certain degree, the later stratigraphy is preserved by this modern architecture and gives us much more information from the Islamic down to the let's say Ptolemaic period than you have in Elephantine Island. So this is both a curse and it's a privilege to have the situation.
That is a very fascinating model, actually. So we have another question. What is the place of archive or historical sources in your research work?
Yeah, as I said, that's why I showed this reference to Sophia Bernasio. Of course, I'm not a specialist, an Arabist, or a specialist in medieval archaeology per se. So I'm depending on collections, on other scholars, historians who prepare these stuff and who collect the material and the sources, and then I'm rather parasitic here and harvest these things. And I just have to say, I think this work of this small short contribution of Sophia Bernasio is a very good account of the historical sources, and you can start there with this article and continue from that and look it up. So these are accessible publications, and as I said, there are Ostraca and other sources, and a huge amount of data from the stele from the Fatimid cemetery, of course, but there also is only a part of it published. And I think one has to work with the collections of colleagues and other historians and scholars to start somewhere, I think, if you look for the historical sources. But as I said, Sophia Börnese also stated that the historical record is surprisingly poor for Aswan. So there is not really a lot in terms of description of the town or real events. If it's not, a war or whatever, an intervention of the central government, it's really not very let's say thorough. So it's a sketchy image we get.
Thank you very much. If there is any further question, your last chance, if you want to ask, put your questions. Well, I think this is it. Thank you very much for the wealth of information that you provided us, the clarity of the presentation. It has been really a pleasure to have you, sir. Thank you. Way better than I would have ever imagined. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
For our next presentation, which should take place in March, in February 15, by Professor Allison, because of a strike, academic strike in UK, it might not be taking place on that time, and we will have to reschedule it. For that, I will email everybody with a new date. But following that, we have our last in March 1st by Professor Ahmed Shouki. He will be addressing his work in Sheikh Al-Arab Hammam Citadel, another very important site that we'll be looking forward for his talk. Thank you so much, Mr. Muller, for this, and sorry for the glitches that happened in the audio earlier. No. Thank you. And
thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.